Welcome to this morning's session. So unfortunately there's not more people here because I think the session promises to be a very interesting one. But it's the curse of the Sunday morning. The Saturday night and the Sunday morning seems to be a curse not only of the general population, but the curse of the left as well. But anyway, we'll have to make do and get, as I say, have a good session and a good discussion. I don't know whether my leaders want me to continue to make the announcement about the list. I think by this time most people will have completed the attendance list, and that doesn't need to be circulated. And people are well aware of the fact that there's two exits to the place where we all come in, and the back in the case of an emergency. So that's the sort of by way of the housekeeping. The session is entitled Equal Opportunities for All Its Citizens. The two speakers are extremely distinguished and have both got a great track record in research and writing on the topic. Therese is going to explore the question in the context of the role of the labour movement and the struggle for equality in the general national independence movement and around 1916. And Mary is going to speak about the role of the women's movement as autonomous, independent political actors in that struggle. So I think the order is agreed. Is Therese is going to make the opening presentation, and then Mary will follow up, and then we'll have discussion. So Therese, please.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and whether it's really kind of what I have to say will really fill that brief or not, I'm not sure. But in 20 minutes, I decided to sort of, to some extent, be a little more sort of, I suppose, episodes of events to some extent. So, sisters and brothers, although perhaps we should really start by using a much more traditional form of address in the labour movement, which of course is brothers and sisters. Using the language of family. As anyone who's been a member of a family knows, kinship, no matter how close, of course, is no guarantor of equality, especially one modelled on the foundations of patriarchy. So the family greeting contains, in a sense, both the dilemmas and the contradictions of the labour movement's expression of equality. The labour movement and the struggle for equality begs a lot of questions. The labour movement can be a rather neat phrase for what's often an unwieldy entity. It could be a baggy and ill-fitting and uneven, encompassing at different times the trade unions and their accompanying and the spin-off of political parties of social democracy, labour, socialist, communist and beyond. And in a sense, when I kind of was looking at this, you just think of the Red Queen. Words mean whatever I want them to mean. So equality is not even more precise either. It can mean very different things. And the claim to be treated the same and due identical rights and entitlements can often be contradicted, in a sense, by demands for compensatory measures of redress within a discriminatory system. And of course, more notoriously perhaps, the decades of the USA southern states discrimination and the South African apartheid system both hid behind the quasi-legal interpretation of being equal but different. And so we're dealing with slippery words with mercurial meanings where they may sound the same but can acquire different significance or outcomes. In 1916, Irish trade unions were the strongest labour organisation in Irish society, overshadowing what was then an infant Labour Party, which had only been launched 4 years earlier, and whose naming would depend entirely on the Irish Trade Union Congress, and Labour Party from 1914. Urban socialist societies effectively stood outside it. They didn't have any kind of organisational representation within it, although, of course, overlapping membership was always encouraged. James Connolly, who was the mover of the motion to set up the Labour Party, remained a member of the Socialist Party of Ireland, which he had returned to Ireland to organise in 1910. The insistence that Irish Labour Party members had to be trade unionists would also limit the appeal of its political agency in the coming years. Looking back over 200 years brings into view these small town and city clubs and societies of skilled working men that had emerged out of the old chartered guilds and become detached from the liveried societies of merchants and masters, but retain very often their hierarchies of class and gender, their rituals, their regalia, their regulations and their rule books, equipped also with new customs but old iconography, retaining quite often the patronage of their saints, like the Dublin's St Anne's Society of Bakers or the plasterers and bricklayers St Bartholomew. These men, like the members of the Court Cabinet Maker Society of the late 18th century, kept minutes. They listed their members. They noted the votes on the decisions that they took at their regular meetings, perhaps occasionally maybe even fining people who didn't attend meetings, their members. They maintained funds for their periods of unemployment, sickness and burials, including family support, and money to treat tramps, those men that they recognised as members of associated societies who come to town to look for work. They might, as these Corkmen did, record their loyal oaths to the king as a friendly society, but then pass motions that insisted on a citywide price for their labour and regulated the numbers of apprentices that could be taken on in their trade, the business of and a legal combination. If they went on strike, they called it a turnout, using the same phrase that would be used by the rebels of 1798. And these societies began to employ a very unique custom of their own, the picket. The Cork Minute Book is one of the oldest Irish trade union records, and it actually lies in Warwick University in the heartland of England, and is a reminder of the long line of succession between then and now, because it actually exists as part of the records of the Amalgamated Carpenters Union, which inherited it when the cabinet makers joined up. Such records of direct democracy was embraced by trade union men at a time when really most people in the country could neither read nor write, when only a handful of wealthy property owners had any form of a vote in political affairs, and when authorities had no interest in their local neighbourhoods or the data, where these new working men's societies were aimed to improve their members' wages and conditions throughout their district. If they were sometimes criticised for their struggles spilling into violence, and the Webb's History of Trade Unions wrote of Irish trade unions annexing antiquity in their picturesque claims of authenticity and of their violence, later historians have noted that working men organised in a very hostile and violent system. Unions, of course, were outlawed for a lot of the period from the late 18th century into the early 19th century. And the Irish Parliament in College Green in particular passed laws that allowed especially severe physical punishments, so that you got instances like weavers being whipped through the streets of Dublin for combining in a society, or a city publican who was put in the pillory in 1770 for allowing the tailors to meet on his premises. So trade union democracy had its limits. These societies embraced exclusivity. Thousands worked beyond their remit, outside the regulated craft, and yet more workers were excluded by their gender. The rule books of the old trade union clubs would provide for the admission only of sons and male relatives. That was very often number one rule. From the 1800 Act of Union, the trades unions raised their strong voice for repeal. They saw their work disappearing across the Irish Sea, and their anxiety has often been dismissed by historians who said that wasn't the reason, why Irish trade began to decline. But the plasterer or carpenter, who saw sights like the destruction of the Earl of Moira's house on Usher's Quay, with its ballroom of mother of pearl packed up and sent off to Scotland, believed very strongly that they were witnessing the cause of the decline in their city's fortunes. The Irish trade unionists became outspoken critics of Ireland's constitutional subordination within the United Kingdom, believing their work to be eroded by it, and throughout the 19th century, Irish unions acting in concert regularly supported demands for constitutional reform and became very, very strong supporters of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and in particular, obviously, for the Home Rule issue. The tension between equality and exclusion of craft workers' democracy remained, in a sense, embedded in trade unions' organisational structures. Technological change had fashioned new workforces and transformed old ones, and in national and amalgamated unions, direct democracy of the old societies was now replaced by representation. The emergence of the delegate, at times one of the moments really, could be one of the most powerful people in the union. Women found factory work when new machinery was installed, and the 19th century workforce of women raised anxieties among the organised workforce of men. They were seen to be taking men's jobs and as being difficult to organise. But thoughtful leadership of the late 19th century could admit that they had their own part to play in that. John Ward of the Dublin Painters Union chaired the Irish Federation Trade and Labour Congress in 1888, which was an early effort at a national trade union body. Why not establish women's unions, he asked. Sure, such can and should be done. They were started, he pointed out, in 1880 when the British TUC had come to Dublin and had met in the ancient concert rooms, and would have succeeded but for the want of perseverance on our own part. And he also spoke up for the women factory inspectors should be appointed. It's absolutely necessary to have women appointed if the Act is to be of any use whatsoever. By 1916, the labour movement might be seen as an apparently formidable national presence. There were trades councils in most towns and cities, there were women's unions, and the great mass of unskilled workers now had their own unions as part of this new and structural development. There were political differences within the Irish labour movement about Home Rule, but these were left mainly unexplored and large to maintain unity. Trade union activities frequently dominated the news pages of the daily papers, and their meetings were routinely reported in them. If there's a missing set of minutes of a Trades Council, you can follow quite often the Trades Council debates because the newspapers routinely published them. The 6-month lockout in Dublin had mobilised men and women outside the labour movement. Looking back, Helena Maloney, organiser of the Irish Women Workers' Union, said, "National freedom and social emancipation were synonymous terms to all of us." And she spoke of how many shared that sense, compounding the popular history of old Gaelic society with these fundamental tenets of Labour's aim for social justice. All shared, she wrote, in the general desire to get back to a mode of life by which the nation would be administered as a clan, and where each contributed according to his abilities and each received according to his needs. By this period, she said, we were also patronisingly sympathetic to the British and other labour movements. We thought that our new Gaelic system would have none of the problems of the haves and have-nots, and would share with each other the wealth that we created. None of us were conspicuous of being superior or meant to patronise anybody, but we did feel that we had a plan that had been built up by our ancestors which would settle all our problems. The struggle of Dublin of workers, most starkly demonstrated by the 6-month Dublin lockout of 1913 to 14, exposed the scale of the problems. When James Larkin joined with others, she wrote, and lifted the poor labourer off his knees and onto his feet, one may say that the whole world was horrified by the conditions of the Dublin poor, which his movement revealed. And of course, at this time, the unions had kind of not, primarily obviously interested in work, but had reached out through their long disputes and very drawn out, difficult strikes and particularly through lockouts into communities and communities, the idea of how to mobilise them. Larkin himself described how he wanted his members to look on the union itself as a family, and that the union should be there for all the families of members as well. But it wasn't only the poor labourer who was on the move into the trade union movement. White-collar trade unionism was also coming to the fore at that time. The roll call of the dead after the Easter Rising and executions named craft workers and labour union members like Richard O'Carroll of the bricklayers, Paddy Mackin of the painters, James Connolly and Michael Mallon of the transport and general workers. And included, of course, Eamon Cant, Sean McDermott and John McBride were all members of the Local Government Officials Union. What was new among the white-collar workers was not trade unionism as such. I mean, national school teachers had organised for about 50 years, but they were now bringing their concerns to the wider labour movement and would all shortly affiliate for the first time to the Irish Trade Union Congress. The deaths and arrests that followed the rising, numbering so many hundreds, devastated the labour movement's organisation, and trade union officials who had nothing to do with it were swept up into the internment and into the prisons, along with many hundreds of the members of the unions. The Irish labour movement was rent by war and rebellion, and Belfast effectively had withdrawn from the Irish TUC and went on to develop a more independent labour movement that looked particularly to Britain. And in 1920, they kind of elected about half a dozen or so members on the local council as Labour. Important issues of equality were left unresolved, not least of them equality of membership. And when the women's movement of the 1970s began to address gender inequality, they organised most effectively within the trade union movement and transformed much of the way that it operated and also modified its structures. And I just want to refer to one small, not a small incident, but an incident that is, or an aspect that's very often overlooked. Back in the 1970s, when Ireland's membership of the European Union was obliged the state to accord with a set of principles of equality, was the imminent question of equal pay and opportunity. The Irish government sought to defer that decision, people may remember, and asked for it to be put on ice. Two women who worked for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union put together a petition. They printed it out on the union duplicator without asking any official permission, and they sent it out through the context. No web, no just typing and turning the printing drum, and only a postal system and huge amounts of goodwill and solidarity to distribute it. 25,000 signatures were collected within a fortnight that demanded that the Irish government honour its obligations to its women citizens, and it became a big focus of the women at that time, and led to all sorts of other issues and opened the agenda for others to follow them through.
Thanks very much, Therese. The next speaker is Mary Cullen.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I hope you'll all forgive me for sitting down. I have a problem standing and I've got a bit of vertigo. The 1916 proclamation said that the Irish Republic claims the allegiance of every Irish man and Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberties, civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all the citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and all its parts, cherishing all the children of the nation equally. And it looked forward to, when it had succeeded in its purpose, in establishing a government representative of the whole people of Ireland and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women. Now, for the society envisaged by the proclamation, and while we kind of debate and discuss what that kind of society might consist of, I'd like to argue that the women's movement has direct relevance to this. The women's movement actually addressed and addresses questions of what it means to be an autonomous human being and a citizen who actively contributes to creating the common good. And the women's movement, which really emerged in the 19th century as an organised movement, developed in the context of the economic and intellectual developments of the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. With the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of manufacturing, commerce and finance, the middle classes were growing in numbers and in wealth. And this had very different results for women and for men. Workplace and family home were increasingly separated as middle-class families moved into the new suburbs. And middle-class women were increasingly confined to the domestic or private sphere, while middle-class men were actually moving on into political office and political power. And at the same time, the Enlightenment thinking put an emphasis on the power of human reason to transform human nature and human society, and it encouraged ideas of democracy on the grounds that all human beings had shared rational human nature. Now, few of the male thinkers actually included women in this equality, but some women did, and they were able to use that as well to support claims that women too were human persons with both the right and the duty as well as the right to develop individual potential and contribute to shaping society. Laws and customs differed from country to country, but overall gender relationships were similar enough for activists to see themselves as part of an international women's movement. In Ireland, women share the same general civil and political disabilities as other women in the United Kingdom. And then the position was that under the common law, when a woman married, her civil identity merged with that of her husband. She could not sue or be sued without his being joined in the action. He was the sole guardian of their children. Her inherited and earned property, all of it except if it was landed estate, which was maybe entailed, but her inherited or earned property came completely under his control to use or dispose of as he pleased. If she left him, he was the sole guardian of their children, as I said, and if she left him, his duty to support her actually ended. In education, access to the universities and degrees were confined to men, and thus entrance to the higher professions. Sexual double standards pervaded laws and social attitudes. Political participation, from voting in parliamentary elections to sitting in the House of Commons to taking public office, was confined to males. Now, in Ireland, legislative change had to come from the United Kingdom Parliament at Westminster, so cooperation between feminists across the whole United Kingdom was very understandable. And in the 19th century, it's very interesting that the leading Irish activists they were nearly all seem to have been middle class, unionist in politics, Protestant in religion, with Quakers particularly prominent. At this stage, to many Irish nationalists, feminism appeared a kind of an English import. And politically active nationalist women, both Catholic and Protestant, they were involved in campaigns from Catholic emancipation, repeal of the Union, Young Ireland, the Fenians, Home Rule, the Land League, the Ladies' Land League. On the feminist front in Ireland in the 19th century, there was action on four main issues: married women's property, education, the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, the parliamentary vote on the same terms as men. The issues interacted. Married women's property law restricted the autonomy of women of every social class. And when you put it in conjunction with exclusion from the universities and the professions, it encouraged middle-class girls' education to concentrate on accomplishments that would lead to advantageous marriage rather than on intellectual development, economic independence and so on. And this education then in turn restricted the development of women's human potential, and if they got the vote, would lessen their ability to use it to advance the common good. The vote itself was a civil right, but it would also empower women to share in influencing public policy. And feminists believed that women would bring the values society associated with women, nurturing and caring, into public political decision-making. And exercising the vote then in itself would further women's individual self-development. In 1875, Isabella Todd, a Presbyterian based in Belfast and a leading figure in all the campaigns, summed up the feminist case. Women, she wrote, were citizens of the state, inheritors with men of all the history which ennobles a nation, guardians with men of all the best life of the nation, bound as much as men are bound to consider the good of the whole, and justified as much as men are justified in sharing the good of the whole. Action across the board in the different areas included setting up committees and associations, educating public opinion by letters to the newspaper, by drawing room and public meetings, by organising petitions to Parliament, by lobbying MPs to introduce and support legislation that promoted women's rights. On married women's property, action in Ireland was essentially part of an English-led campaign. Committees were formed in Dublin and Belfast, petitions organised, MPs lobbied. Isabella Todd, the Irish woman, who was actually the only female witness to a select committee of the House of Commons on married women's property in 1868, she explained that Irish feminists' main concern was for poorer married women who took employment to support their families. The law left their earnings completely at the mercy of their husbands. And in 1870, the first of a series of Acts of Parliament granting gradually increasing degrees of control over their property to married women. The Contagious Diseases Acts had been passed in the 1860s to protect the health of the Army and Navy. In designated areas in Ireland, the Curragh, Cork and Queenstown, now Cove, a woman suspected of being a prostitute could be sent for compulsory treatment, and if she found to be suffering from a venereal disease, for compulsory treatment before she returned to work. Feminists opposed the double standards that targeted the women but not the men. Here too, Action in Ireland was really part of an English-based campaign. The issue was a very challenging one, as middle-class women were not expected to know much about prostitution or even about sex, still less make public speeches about them. But they did, and eventually the acts were repealed in 1886. Action regarding education and the vote developed in Ireland in the context of political developments here. High schools and colleges for girls and women to provide higher standards and better teachers were established. They included the Ladies' Collegiate School, later Victoria College, founded by Margaret Byers in Belfast in 1859, and Alexandra College, founded in Dublin by Anne Jellicoe in 1866. They were among the leading colleges. Irish feminists made major breakthroughs by successfully lobbying to have women included and girls included in the provisions of the 1878 Intermediate Education Act and the 1879 University Act. The Intermediate Education Act set up an Intermediate Education Board which organised public examinations to which all schools could enter pupils, and schools received a capitation fees depending on the number of subjects passed by their pupils. The original intention of both acts had been to encourage and give government support to male Catholic education and help to wean middle-class Catholic Ireland away from support for home rule. By opening the opportunity to girls, of course, girls' schools were able to enter the intermediate examination boards, and immediately not only did they get money for doing that, but they also encouraged higher standards and a wider range of subjects. Under the University Act, the Royal University was established not as a purely examination and degree awarding institution, and no attendance in any specific institutions was required, which meant people could come from anywhere and get degrees. And this, of course, opened the opportunity to women. And the women's colleges immediately began preparing students for examinations in the Royal University. And bit by bit, feminists were able to press the existing universities, that is the Trinity College, the Three Queens Colleges, which were the first to do it, and University College in Dublin, the successor of the Catholic University, which was now run by the Jesuits, to actually admit women to their degree courses. Action on the parliamentary vote began around the 1860s. Isabella Todd founded the North of Ireland Women's Suffrage Society around 1872-3, and Anna and Thomas Haslam founded the Dublin Women's Suffrage Association in 1876. These were among the leading suffrage associations. There were others as well in the North of Ireland. Action aimed at having amendments, including women, added to legislation that extended the vote to widening categories of men, and also at legislation solely for women's suffrage. In 1896, in the area of local government, the Irish women won eligibility for election as poor law guardians, and under the Local Government Act of 1898 they gained the vote and eligibility for election in the rural and urban district councils and the vote in the county and borough councils. They didn't get eligibility there until 1911. But the parliamentary vote remained elusive and became the central campaign in the early 20th century. And by the early 20th century, more Catholic and nationalist women were becoming active feminists. They had benefited by the gains made by the pioneers, and also they were highly politicised in the cultural and nationalist revival in the second half of the 19th century. And they were entering more, and they were shared in the general optimism among nationalist Ireland that home rule was coming. And so women now felt that they could certainly become a feminist and push women's claims as well. The suffrage movement grew internationally, and some suffragists, frustrated by the failure of strictly constitutional methods of lobbying and petitions and so on, turned to civil disobedience of various kinds, and finally some to physical violence. And suffragettes was the name given to these militants. And in the early 20th century, as home rule became a likely eventuality, feminism and suffrage interacted with the growing tension between nationalism and unionism. New suffrage organisations appeared, most strictly constitutional in method, some militant, some unionist in sympathy, some nationalist. Nationalist feminists faced the question of priorities. Should they campaign for a United Kingdom suffrage legislation which would give suffrage to all women throughout the United Kingdom, or should they as nationalists put suffrage on hold until home rule was achieved and put their efforts into that, relying on Irish men to then give women the vote? The Irish Women's Franchise League was founded in 1908 by a group led by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Margaret Cousins, one from a Catholic nationalist background, one from a Protestant unionist background, but both nationalists in sympathy. And they were founded as a militant group, not party politically aligned, but nationalists in sympathy, and a group that was a militant group prepared to break the law if necessary. And its newspaper, The Irish Citizen, published from 1912 to 20, became one of the best sources for feminist thinking in that period. It was a forum for suffrage and feminist thinking. And the motto on its masthead echoed the claims expressed by Isabella Todd 40 years earlier. The motto read, "For men and women equally the rights of citizenship, from men and equally the duties of citizenship." And the same holistic view of feminist aims continued. Women's personal development and the belief that women would use the vote to change political decision-making towards a fairer, more caring society. As well as a general opposition to war as a solution to disputes, a pacifist strand emerged, which ranged from opposition to any use of physical force to opposition with exceptions in the case of a just war or a just rebellion. The feminism interacted with suffrage and the labour movement. Many young nationalist feminists were socialists. 19th century feminists had always believed that as more privileged middle-class women, they had a responsibility to their poorer sisters, and many were active in philanthropic work. Now in the pages of the Irish Citizen, it's very interesting that middle-class socialists argued that working-class women should lead themselves and decide their own priorities when they wanted to improve working conditions and when they wanted to look for the vote. The Irish Women Workers' Union was founded in 1911 under the auspices of the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union and with the support of nationalist feminists. And during the 1913 lockout, nationalist feminists helped in Liberty Hall and in supporting workers' families. When the Home Rule, the Third Home Rule, was introduced in Parliament in 1912, all suffragists, whether they were unionists or nationalists, wanted women to have the vote in an Irish Parliament. Unionists mightn't want Home Rule to come, but if there was an Irish Parliament, they wanted women to have the vote in it. Similarly, English suffragists felt along the same lines. And the Irish Parliamentary Party was lobbied to introduce a suffrage amendment to the Home Rule Bill. So far, members of the Irish Parliamentary had a very good record on individuals giving support to legislation supporting women's rights. But now John Redwin, their leader, himself anti-suffrage and also afraid of jeopardising Home Rule in this passage through Parliament, refused to allow them to do that and prevented their supporting a limited suffrage bill that was introduced in 1912. And this led to militant action in Dublin and later more violent militancy in Ulster, where Ulster unionist feminists were further enraged when Sir Edward Carson failed to deliver on an undertaking to include women's suffrage in a provisional Ulster unionist government. And between 1912 and 1914, 35 suffragettes throughout Ireland were imprisoned for militancy. In Dublin, 8 members of the Irish Women's Franchise, the Irish Women's Franchise League, including Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, set out on a morning to break windows in government property, to get arrested, brought to court, fined, refuse to pay, make speeches and be sent to jail, all to kind of publicise the cause, which they did. And then in 1914, World War I made suffrage campaigning very difficult and made feminist work in general difficult. Unionist suffragists tended to suspend activity and engage in war work, hoping to strengthen the claim for the vote when the war was over. In 1916, the relationship between the Irish Women's Franchise League, Cumann na Gael, which had been established in 1914 as an auxiliary to the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Women Workers' Union, and their relationship with the leadership of the Easter Rising led to the proclamation, as we've seen, endorsing women's citizenship and claiming the allegiance of every Irish man and Irish woman, and guaranteeing, as we've said, religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all the citizens. And this became nationalist feminists' strongest claim to follow through on this in whatever settlement was reached in the end. After 1916, nationalist feminists were active in the expansion of Sinn Féin as the party of Republicans, and it soon became clear that the new leadership was not committed to gender equality, and now Nation First and Suffrage First feminists came together to form Cumann na Deachtaire, the League of Delegates, to press for representation of women in all Republican bodies and to insist on the follow-through on the promise of the proclamation. In 1918, United Kingdom legislation gave women a partial suffrage to women over 30 with a property qualification, and also gave eligibility to be elected as members of Parliament. And in the December 1918 general election, Constance Markievicz, as a Sinn Féin candidate in Dublin, was the only woman elected to the Westminster Parliament. But nationalist feminists felt let down by Sinn Féin men. They had only run 2 female candidates, the other being Winifred Carney in a ward in Belfast where a nationalist had absolutely no chance of being elected. And the women felt that the Sinn Féin men hadn't really supported their campaigning. Discrimination has not died out with the Irish Party, commented the Irish Citizen. When the Sinn Féin members of Parliament assembled in Dublin in January 1919 and established Dáil Éireann and declared a republic, Markievicz was appointed Minister for Labour, another first for women. But events were moving on. The War of Independence from 1919 to 21 made suffrage campaigning absolutely impossible. But in this case, Cumann na Món was able to take a much more active part than had been possible in 1916. And the value of Cumann na Món's contribution was recognised by male leaders, including people like Tom Barry. Nationalist feminists were able to use this, together with the 1916 proclamation, to insist that women's citizenship be included in whatever final settlement was reached. Ireland was partitioned in 1920, and in 1921 the truce in the war was followed by negotiations, the treaty, and divisions over the treaty. Nationalist feminists took opposing sides on the treaty itself and during the civil war which followed from 1922 to 3. And during the troubled year of 1922, the constitution of the Irish Free State was drawn up, and feminists right up to the end were continuing to insist that women's full citizenship should be included in it. And it did so in Article 3, where it said that the Constitution said that every person domiciled in the jurisdiction, without distinction of sex, shall enjoy the privileges and be subject to the obligations of such citizenship. But the women's movement now entered a new stage. Citizenship had been achieved in circumstances of revolution and war and didn't reflect a consensus among male nationalists. And this became clear during the 1920s and the 1930s, as first Cumann na Gael and then Fianna Fáil governments clawed back various elements of that citizenship, including allowing examinations for competitive examinations in the civil service to include a kind of a gender barrier, a sex barrier, I should say. It included restricting women's jury service from full compulsion to be on the register to eventually a situation where a woman would only be on the register if she actually applied to be it. In 1932, a marriage bar was introduced for national teachers, where women national teachers had to retire in marriage, and the marriage ban was extended to the entire civil service. In the 1936 Conditions of Employment Act, the Minister for Labour was empowered to restrict or prohibit the employment of women. He didn't have to do it, but he could do it if he thought men's employment was threatened by women's competition there. And throughout all these decades, when all this was happening, feminist resistance continued to all these pieces of legislation, gaining some small advantages and failing in others, right up to the emergence of the second wave of the women's movement in Ireland around 1970. And at the same time, over these decades, feminists continued and further developed their long-standing commitments to improving female education, female employment opportunities and conditions, as Therese was referring to, and combating sexual double standards. And they now added the new challenge of actively encouraging women's participation in politics and decision-making. And to sum up, the Irish women's movement throughout its long career was created by unionists and nationalists, home rulers and republicans, liberals and socialists, Protestants of many denominations, Catholics and women of no religion. It's an integral part of Irish history, and it addresses basic questions of what it means to be an autonomous human being and an active citizen sharing and creating the common good. And its relevance is very relevant, it seems to me, to debate and discussion that we're having today about what is the kind of society that was envisaged in the proclamation and how do we bring that society into being. And it seems to me that one of the ways in which the women's movement can engage in that is if we get it written completely, its story written completely into the survey history books. History is important to everybody. History tells us how we got to where we now are and provides a base for which we can hope to make informed decisions about where we go from here. It's important for everybody, for girls and boys, women and men. Knowledge of the women's movement and that history is important. Now, for most people, history is what happened in the history books. What's not there has not happened. So far, we have a very impressive body of published research on the Irish women's movement, and already some of the mainstream histories, survey histories, which are what most people gain their knowledge of history from, are including aspects of this. And the challenge, it seems to me, fitting in with carrying through on the promise of the proclamation, is for all of us to understand our development of the movement itself and to achieve its full incorporation into mainstream survey histories. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both speakers for really stimulating contributions. And I think actually Mary's concluding comments would apply equally to what Teresa was talking about and our own contribution, in the sense that we need more education and indeed political education in regard to the topics, today's two topics. We'll have at least a half an hour for discussion.